Hi, this is Joe Kopsick. It's March 24th, 2021, and today I'm going to talk about 13 myths about libertarians. Democrats and Republicans and other kind of statists want people to think libertarians are all pro-corporate, all capitalists, all hate the poor, and want to lower taxes because of some evil intention. So I just want to clear that up because a lot of that is complete bullcrap. Some of it's true about some of our members, but most of the people in the Libertarian Party and the Libertarian movement, which is wider, um, they don't hate the poor. They want people to have wealth and opportunity and freedom. So here we go. Myth number one, the idea that we're all right wing or capitalists. That's not true. There's over 40 caucuses in the Libertarian Party. 10 or 15 of them, at least, are left leaning or left wing or overtly socialist, even. There's the Libertarian Socialist Caucus, which is the most well known. And they advocate a strategy called bottom unity, which says that the bottom half of the political spectrum, everyone who's more decentralizationist than the middle line, regardless of economic affiliation, should work together against the fascists and the statists and the people who want more centralization of government and more monopoly. So that's the bottom unity strategy. That favors the left and left libertarians and right libertarians working together in what can be described as the alliance of the libertarian left. And we also support mutual aid. You see, the libertarian principle, as far as economics go, is free markets, which means voluntary exchange. So you have to actually consent, to the economic activity. So it also has to be mutually beneficial, though, to guarantee that nobody's sacrificing, nobody's being expected to sacrifice in the economic transaction. So it's really fair in addition to being free. So that's the mutualist principle. And Lysander Spooner, who was an individualist anarchist, individualist anarchists like Benjamin Tucker and mutualists like Pierre Joseph Proudhon, there was very little distinction because it's like as an individualist or as a person in the middle, a mutualist, a centrist economic position, you can choose between how much you want to associate with the socialists or how much you want to associate with the capitalists or whatever you want to call them. So people like Spooner and Tucker and Henry George, who, it's hard to describe his economic position, but it's basically center. Like Ron Paul was saying to people, read Lysander Spooner. It's like, oh, he's an individualist anarchist. They were basically mutualists. So libertarianism doesn't always lead to capitalism. And that brings me to myth number two. We're not all anarcho-capitalists. Libertarian Party is an alliance of minarchists and people who agree to be in a political party but still want anarchism. Now, you might describe these people as anarcho-capitalists, but really anyone who's philosophized or theorized or just wants to participate in a stateless framework that has markets, you could call that anarcho-capitalism if you want, but the actual person you're talking to, if they want that, they might not necessarily support capitalism. They might want a system where, like, there's a book of anarchist and libertarian thought. It's called Markets, Not Capitalism. Somebody can be pro-market but anti-capitalism. Like the Polish trade unions, they were pro-market but anti-capitalism. It's very important to know because that's what ended, the Cold War. They elected a democratic government. So they allowed democracy and capitalism to exist side by side. Like there's ways to resolve this stuff, but I kind of got a little distracted. Minarchists favor a minimum government, and libertarians support a limited government. But some people in the party do want anarchism, but they see progressively more decentralization and more decentralization as the way of getting to that anarcho quote unquote capitalist paradise or that stateless market society or that market oriented social economy or whatever Gary Johnson or Gary Chartier calls it. But yeah, the point is we don't all want anarcho-capitalism. Anarcho-capitalism doesn't necessarily mean that the markets will go completely unregulated. You see, even if you got rid of the state regulations, we would still see some regulations by, unions would still participate in contracts, or somebody who represents the workers would still participate in contract making with people who own machines and production factories and workplaces. Now, how that's going to end up in the absence of a state, it's really hard to know. But the point is, I don't remember that, but no. So without the state, you don't know. Like capitalism might not be able to be sustained without the state. So libertarians will be like, "Oh, good, let's keep the state." Well, I'll say, then get rid of the state. If capitalist expropriation and if the profits can be sustained without the state's violence, you know, coercing people and depriving people into lowering their prices after they do work and after they like when they sell their goods, like people in the third world who want to sell their avocados, like America is just stealing them, and everyone's like, why are all these millennials eating these avocados? They're really paying a lot for them. It's like we should be asking how much you're stealing, how much value you're stealing from the people who are farming them. So, in the absence of the state and imperialism, we would have a lot less violence and coercion to pressure and deprive people into lowering their prices for the work they do. And I don't see how limiting government, shrinking government is going to do much bad in the world. It would decrease the amount of military activity in foreign countries. It would decrease the level of imperialism. And I think it would decrease the ability of capitalist companies to reap profit on the back of people who do work while the managers don't do any work and just beg for government handouts. See, that's how the rich are the real welfare queens. John Stossel exposed that. He was a liberal, and then he started describing himself as a libertarian because the Democrats just hated him and didn't understand. He's just doing consumer reporting. He's criticizing companies. And the Democrats are like, you're threatening jobs. I'm going to call my union because you're trying to fire my fucking unionized person who's doing something wrong and actually not doing work. So I'm going to get to unions in a sec. One more thing about limited government. A lot of people think limited government is bad. It'll stop the government from being able to crush rebellions or censor your speech or take your guns or whatever, or stop you from going into quarantine. Like, oh God, let's not limit the government. If we limited the government, we could defund the police or have term limits or have legal gay marriage with no state being able to stop it. Or we could legalize drugs and the federal government wouldn't be able to stop it. Wouldn't that be horrible if we didn't have police unions, if we didn't have giant public sector unions threatening to grow government all the time, to take more of our freedom and our wealth and our information every single year? Wouldn't that be awful if we limited government? So yeah, libertarians support limited government. That's not a bad thing. That's myth number 3. Myth number 4, we don't hate unions. Like the left, we don't like police unions. But when we started talking about that 10 years ago, we were also criticizing teachers' unions because they were molesting 23 of our kids every school day. But he didn't want to talk about that. That was Alex Jones conspiracy nonsense. But yeah, when we were talking about police unions, you're still uncomfortable 10 years ago, leftists. So we don't hate all unions. We just don't like police unions, and we don't like it when public sector unions are allowed to grow the government beyond its constitutional strictures, which is federal government manages money, military, and mail, and the states and the people do everything else. That was the arrangement. It's like not all libertarians might not agree with what I just said, but that's where the original Constitution was set up. Like that's where the conversation has to start as far as politics go. It's like, do you want a bigger government from there? Democrats and Republicans, yes. Libertarians, probably no. Keep it there or shrink it. So that'll tell us there's a set of cabinet level agencies that we can get rid of. And I'll get to that when I talk about corporations. So we don't hate all unions. We just hate it when public sector unions take people's money without their consent and, con them into using that, those union dues for political donations to parties that those government workers might not necessarily want them to. So it's like, if you decide to work for the government, you're automatically a Democrat because your money will end up in Democrats' pockets. So we don't want that. But in the terms of private sector, unionize, go for it. Voluntary unionization, go for it completely. Now, there's some people in the Libertarian Party, I'll admit, probably even half of them, who don't like most unions, think that unions have done bad. And I don't agree with that. A solid quarter of us at least would say, and the Libertarian Socialist Caucus has endorsed this. If you repeal Taft-Hartley, the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, it would acknowledge, hey, the National Labor Relations Board it doesn't do anything because they can deny your right to have a strike. The Taft-Hartley Act limits your right to boycott. The Taft-Hartley Act limits your right to have secondary labor actions, which is coordinated boycotts across multiple industries. So you repeal the Taft-Hartley Act and you restore the right to strike and boycott without the government's permission. I, as a libertarian, support you, leftists. And when we saw last year the Staten Island Amazon workers strike, when they were like, I don't know if I'll get sick if I show up to work. I'm not going in. And I don't think they asked the National Labor Relations Board, if a government bureau, you see, we have a secret labor court inside the government, inside the Department of Labor, and the justices are appointed by presidents. So we have an unelected board of judges deciding who can have a legitimate strike and who can't. Well, we need wildcat strikes. I've been a libertarian for 14 years, and for 10 of those years, I've supported wildcat strikes. And I've talked to union people who are open to abolishing the National Labor Relations Board because they can deny you the freedom to strike. And those people are affiliated with, groups like the IWW, and they would be like socialist and communist types. So like, well, as long as they're libertarian socialists and libertarian communists, as long as they're voluntary communists, hell yeah, I can support that. You don't need a government board stopping your union from striking or boycotting. That's what unions do when they're not working, which is all the time. Hey, no. So, yeah, you have to allow some criticism of unions, leftists, if you want to get along with libertarians, because we know they're not working. We know they're compromised. We know that some unions, like police unions, are not good for this country. So you have to allow a little bit of criticism of unions. We don't hate all unions. We like private sector unions all you want, but don't let public sector unions grow the government or control your political speech. We support voluntarism in all cases. Myth number 5, libertarians do not worship the Constitution. I've had people tell me that, if you quote Ron Paul or you support a constitutional method to ours, we don't care. That's just because libertarians will criticize each other so much, and we're all so individualistic. We just ridicule each other's ideas all the time for no reason. But it's like, yeah, we basically support a limited government more or less in line with the Constitution, which is federal government runs money, mail, and military, and the states or the people run everything else. That's not to say the state gets to control your life on every other issue. The people get to control how much the state is involved in their life, while the federal government manages everybody's, gets them their mail and their money and makes sure there's a military. Simple enough? Well, you might want a larger government, but let me ask you, if you make the government any larger, are your kids going to be able to even remember how the government works when it's so big? And it's like Goliath at this point. It's stumbling around. It's trying to do too many things. It's imperialist. It can't work. We can't teach kids how the government works if it doesn't work, if it's too big to work. The government's too big to fail, let it fail. We can start from scratch. We have the Constitution. If we just teach people how it works, the problem is not the Constitution. The problem is that people don't know how it works and they don't use it anymore. We haven't amended the Constitution in 28 years. It's 1992, and that was an amendment that was proposed 200 years prior. We don't amend the Constitution anymore. We don't teach kids in school how to amend the Constitution. We don't teach people that it doesn't have to take 7 years, which is the maximum. It can take as short as 6 months if people are just resolved to change the Constitution in this way. We could easily pass. There's a group right now that's trying to pass 3 amendments, on limited term limits, taxes, and something else. So we can amend the Constitution. We can even get rid of that 13th Amendment or amend it itself. that allows involuntary servitude in the prisons, slavery in the prisons. We can change that. We can end that. But we don't teach people how to use or amend the Constitution anymore. So, but yeah, worshiping the Constitution, you shouldn't worry that libertarians like the Constitution too much. The Constitution is not being enforced. If the Constitution were being enforced, then your states wouldn't be able to, control your life as much as they are. We would have some ability of the federal government to restrain the states from taking away too much of your freedoms, and your voice would actually be heard. Myth number 6: free markets are not evil, and libertarian support of free markets does not reflect an evil intent. We don't want to free the markets from regulation because we want to legalize all kinds of horrible behavior. Except, of course, Walter Block, for some reason, wrote a whole book on reprehensible behavior and how it can be profited from. It's based on the idea you wouldn't prefer the alternative. It's like the kind of ideology that Walter Block espouses. It could be used to justify, finding someone's corpse and like putting it in a casket and like bringing it to the door of the family who's who's related to them, and just be like, hey, I'll charge you like $500,000. Like, do you want your son's corpse? And they'll be like, where the fuck did you get my son's corpse? Like, that's a horrible thing. You handled our kid's body. Like, what the fuck is going on? And they just be like, oh, sorry, like, I'm going to throw your kid's body away. I'm going to throw it in the fucking river if you don't give me $500,000. Like, that's what Walter Block's ideology could justify. And here's another thing. Here's something that John Stossel has done wrong. He's talked about how like the organ trade is okay. It's like okay, well maybe there's a going rate in the market for your organs, but it's like your willingness to sell your organs depends on how much you're being pressured or coerced or deprived and manipulated, possibly by the state or possibly by the market or your employer. We're all basically working together to steal your values slowly through inflation. But yeah, like libertarians recognize these things, that it is not that we want to keep markets free from regulation to keep bad behavior, profitable or marketable. We want there to, the support of money is out of support of convenience and simplicity. If we're all using the same money, we can, hopefully value things more or less the same. But, the strictures of the Constitution were actually supposed to prevent the vast accumulation of wealth and the vast disproportion of wealth, because it was supposed to prevent the unconstitutional transfer of wealth and the rewarding of one person with the property of someone else unfairly, which is welfareism or subsidies, where it's really just legalized theft. Whether it's from the poor to the rich or the rich to the poor, it's like you can always justify, more money for the rich as long as the poor get crumbs. Like, that's what the Squad and AOC are doing, and this has been going on forever. So we want freedom from the kind of monopolies. You see, libertarians want freedom from monopolies. That's what market freedom means for us. We don't want monopolies to be able to trample all over people's rights and distort pricing. That's why we only have 3 things be federal monopolies: money, mail, and military. Not that all libertarians agree with that. That's the thing that I've been pushing. That's the way I've been pushing it. It's like the way to understand the Constitution. But limited government means limited monopolies, because the state is a monopoly on legitimate violence. So every industry, every economic realm that it gets involved in, it ends up monopolizing. So that's why limitation of government is limitation on monopolies and limitation upon their right to distort prices and interrupt normal market flow, normal commerce, and limiting their ability to rig markets in their favor. So limited government and free markets are actually good for the poor if they're trying to afford things. And be able to make use of their money. And also, limiting government would shrink the amount of regulatory capture that's going on. It would shrink the politicization of every issue and of every industry. It's regulatory capture has been described by Noam Chomsky. It's where businesses get captured by, or sorry, the government agency gets captured by the business that it's supposed to regulate. The business interests end up buying the government. That's regulatory capture. And if you limit government, you'll see less of that. So free markets are not evil, and they're not bad for the poor. Myth number 7, free trade isn't evil. Gary Johnson said that free trade doesn't need a treaty. So trade, we want to liberate trade because we want more exchange going on. We want each country to do what it does best, and we want if each country does what it does best, then it will be able to export the surplus so that the rest of the world can benefit from the production of some good that's unique to that area, which is being produced in the country that produces that good the best. So we want to bring out the best in every region and every country, but not exploit people. Some libertarians are, reckless exploiters for, profit and surplus. But like, if you told them how much the government enables that with its coercion and its violence and its imperialism, then they would change their mind. They wouldn't, like, there's some people who are like pro-Trump and are in the LP because they got rich on Bitcoin. Frankly, yeah, there's a lot of people in the party, and I don't want to associate with people like that. And but there's people like me in the LP too, who favor things like ultra globalization and favor unions and cooperatives and syndical, egalitarian labor managed firms, cooperatives, ELMFs, the thing Richard Wolff has described. Gary Johnson supports having more cooperatives as long as they compete on a market. Like, they don't have to compete. It's just like, if you got rid of Taft-Hartley, cooperatives could all associate with each other. They could all cooperate with each other. And when you have cooperatives cooperating with each other on a voluntary basis in a market, like, that's basically, cooperatives cooperating is a syndicate. It's syndicalism. And when you have it in a market, it's market syndicalism. So that's how left-wing economics and market systems are compatible. And Gary Johnson and Richard Wolff need to get together to talk about cooperatives and them coexisting in a market. And they need to talk about how Taft-Hartley is choking this country and stopping us from having free strikes and free boycotts, which also the leftists need to understand that libertarians are against limitations on boycotts. We support limitations on the government in general, but we're opposed to limitations on the people and the workers and their right to boycott. Until it comes into either political or violent action. We want work to be work, and we want workers to, govern their workplace so that external political government is not necessary. You see, if workplaces can just have a good society and a good cooperation about them, and it's all voluntary, and they can cooperate or compete as much as they want to, and the state won't get involved, and the state doesn't have to get involved. We can have markets and cooperatives coexisting. Libertarians are not opposed to cooperatives, and we're not opposed to cooperatives negotiating a trade. Whatever stops the government from negotiating trade, the government should not negotiate trade. If the government negotiates trade, then the government can negotiate weapons trade. Things are monopolies in this country for a reason. Like, the reason I'm saying money and mail and military have to be a monopoly is because, the military aspect is because, you don't want too much arms sales to other countries, because it's like eventually your military technology gets into other countries' hands and your drone is in Iran suddenly and you have to go get it. Then you have to develop another drone that's better than that one. So you blow all this money making more and more expensive weaponry, and you let other countries have it, and then you have to fight those other countries because some of their people, like there was a revolution or civil unrest there, and you have to fight your former allies and all that kinds of crap. So if you put a limit on the government's ability to monopolize industries and to conduct trade and to sell weapons to other countries, like it's good for everybody. You have less wars, you have less economic interruptions, you have more normal markets that ordinary people can participate in. And whether you're, sole proprietorship or cooperative, you know, we want you to have freedom, freedom to work. We want total freedom of opportunity. We want freedom and fairness in that total equality of opportunity. We want total equality in the political realm and the public realm, total inclusion, but total freedom and privacy in the private realm and at the home. Seems fair enough. It's free and fair. Myth number 9, in case I didn't clarify, myth number 8 was we don't oppose cooperatives. Myth number 9, we don't oppose government health care necessarily. We oppose national control of health care unless and until there's a constitutional amendment saying that the national government has exclusive control over health care. Because right now, that is reserved to the states and the people because of what the 10th Amendment says. So there's a way that the Constitution works, which is the way I just described, and there's a way that the Constitution doesn't work, which is Democrats screaming on the floor of the congressional chambers, demanding a right to vote our gun rights away, or demanding the right to vote for Medicare for all. You don't just scream and get your way. There's an actual constitutional process. And when Democrats tell you that screaming instead of the process is the right way, and that if you disagree with them, then you're not trusting the system, they're not only hypocrites, but they're also factually wrong, and they're on the losing side of history and the argument. The way to do it is to amend the Constitution so that you can have those kinds of controversial votes before you try to take away our right to have private health care or our right to have guns. You have to make something legal before you do it, except in the case of National Labor Relations Act. I mean, I used to say, oh, the Taft-Hartley Act, you have to legalize the boycotts and strikes and legalize a general strike before you do it. But as we saw last year, the general strike, I mean, it's kind of on. It's hard to tell whether it's on or off, but like I was saying, you have to legalize the general strike before you do it. But the NLRA, the NLRB is just ineffective, so it doesn't really matter whether we abolish the Taft-Hartley Act or repeal it, as long as people are willing to strike and boycott without asking the government's permission first. So the NLRB will always be ineffective, and it's like there's so much government that it just like a lot of it doesn't matter whether it exists or not. And when you have government programs that doesn't matter whether they exist or not, then you have people stop paying attention to it because there's too many fucking different departments, and you end up like people just easily take advantage of it and take control of it and say a lot of stuff that makes it look like they're doing good things with it. So in a lot of cases, you got to get rid of these programs or departments before somebody makes them screwed up and evil. So that's why we don't necessarily trust a Medicare for all system. It could end up saving money, but like Rand Paul has proposed like a voluntary market way, like a way for cooperatives and markets to work together, like I've been talking about. He had a 4-point system that said let people join into health insurance cooperatives based on their similar profession, which makes sense because in those professions they're exposed to the same health risks because they're in the same workplace together and they're in the same bargaining unit, which is basically a union. So there's nothing that Rand Paul has said that is opposed to cooperatives existing in a market or is opposed to unions. As long as cooperatives can voluntarily work with each other and cooperate with each other, you can make a health insurance cooperative as big as you want. The only obstacle is the state's existence and how they want to manage it from Washington, D.C. instead of having like, a decentralized network that would operate according to, how many people there are in any given location. Like the states right now are effectively monopolies on where you can get your health insurance from. There's artificial barriers on where you can buy your health insurance from. And a lot of liberals would say in the early days, like 10 years ago, they'd say, oh, libertarians, you support such severe states' rights that you want to cut off the border. You want to have like Mexico style borders around every state. It's like, no, we favor interstate commerce, free interstate commerce with no state borders. We acknowledge that the states are monopolies, and we want to stop the states from being monopolies. We want to diminish that monopoly by returning the economic power to the people and getting rid of the state's ability to monopolize any industry, any economic sphere that it pleases. We want to return economic and social freedom to the people so that no external political governance is necessary. And cooperatives can control, healthcare as much as they want. Workplaces can talk within themselves as much as they want. Here's the thing: the union contracts that are negotiated, those are private contracts because unions, just like governments, for financial purposes, they are considered like private entities. They're corporations. A union is a private entity. It becomes a partial employee. When they ask for union dues, it's like you're paying your union. It's like, well, what if they don't do anything for you? Well, they still make the terms of your employment, which means they're kind of your employer in a way. If your union doesn't work for you, then they're colluding with your employer. So unions are private sector entities, and cooperatives, their role in the economy is to be the nonprofit, alternative to the state that is not capitalist. It doesn't count on a surplus. You see, the government, when they tax you, that confers the obligation on you to earn more money than you would have needed for yourself. It confers an obligation on you to create a surplus. So when liberals and democratic socialists, the squad, when you welcome the government into your life, it confers an obligation on you to be a capitalist because it confers an obligation to make a surplus that you can give to the government in forms of taxes, which they take from you before you get it. So the government's making you into a capitalist. So liberals, when you welcome the government into your life, they're making you into a capitalist when you don't want to be one. Some libertarians might want to be one. But if they realize that, the states are creating monopolies and that they limit people, like I live close to Wisconsin and Indiana. I legally can't buy health insurance from either of those states. People who live in New York City, they live like within 10 miles of New Jersey and Connecticut. They can't legally buy health insurance from those states. You can be across the bridge from a state. In 45 states, you can't buy health insurance. That's the government. That's state limitations on, on the freedom of healthcare. And you might say, well, we need the federal government to stop the states from doing that. It's like, yeah, we could try that. We could just have the states pass laws, that allow people to buy health insurance from across state lines. But it's like the last time they said the federal government was going to make the states stop doing that, like they were talking about that, like under, like in the beginning of Obamacare, like that was the justification for Obamacare. It was one of the justifications. They said they were going to stop, all the differences in health insurance policies between the states, and they didn't do it, but they didn't let the states have their own health insurance monopolies either, because they said they were going to do the Kucinich Amendment and then they just canceled it, which means the states can't monopolize health insurance. They can't have their own universal health care plans. So it's like the federal government doesn't want to stop. It doesn't want to help the states take care of all their people with health insurance, and it doesn't want to stop the states from limiting your right to buy health insurance from across state lines. So the federal government's not interested in helping you get health care. I'm sorry to say it, but there's only 5 people. We need to have the kind of political change that supports that. And frankly, electing more people like Rand Paul, and Gary Johnson and stuff like that, Ron Paul, that's going to have as much change as affecting, as electing people like the Squad, because AOC favors a mixed economy. She admits that the market is good at delivering consumer goods, but she says regulation is still necessary. Rand Paul has acknowledged that cooperatives are good. Gary Johnson has acknowledged that cooperatives are good. There's an overlap between what is a business alliance versus what is an industry trade group versus what is a private sector union. And everyone thinks that a union is just like a cooperative. It's like unions have to declare an intent to be a cooperative. And, we're not talking about alternative economic arrangements. And as long as we have a statist, centralist, democratic government, whatever that means, in the Biden administration, we're not going to have a diverse array of economic schools of thought that's being taught in school. And it's clearly reflected right now. We don't. Everyone associates Democrats with socialism just because there's only two economic systems they know about and only two parties they know about. So the Republicans must be capitalists. They're not. And the Democrats must be socialists. They're not. These labels are overlapping and they don't always necessarily fit. So you can't assume the Democrats are on the left. You can't assume the Libertarians are on the right. So healthcare just comes down to how the right to mandate health insurance, how the right to regulate insurance is authorized. Like, you have to ask, where does that right come from? And say, well, what does consent of the governed say that we should do about that? Well, it should say you have the right to buy health insurance, but also you have the right not to. And we don't have that right now because of the Obamacare insurance mandate. Whether that is being negotiated in courts, it kind of fizzled out, but it's probably coming back. So if you don't have the right to not buy something, like, the price is going to go up, okay? So if we limit the government and say, hey, you can't make us buy health insurance, we don't want to do that to stop poor people from surviving their illness or surviving COVID-19 or 2012. We want them to be able to afford health insurance by saying, hey, this health insurance isn't worth shit to me, and I don't want to pay anything for it. I'll pay you $1, or say, hey, I can't afford it. Like, if you don't have the right to demand a zero price or the right to opt out, the right to say no, then you don't have the right to demand a low price. So you're taking away our right to demand a low price by taking away our right to say no. Libertarianism is about consent of the governed, and we should be, and hopefully we are, the party of consent. We need to do a little work on that, but we support your right to opt out in all cases. Sexual consent, societal, you shouldn't have to congregate with people you don't want to, as evidenced by, the 6-foot rule. You shouldn't have to be forced to be around anyone. You shouldn't have to let anyone touch you. You shouldn't have to disclose your medical information. That's protected by the HIPAA law. Yet when you go into businesses, they're asking you all kinds of stuff about, your health, whether you have a temperature. It's like, I don't have to disclose that. I don't have to tell you anything. It's like, when they authorized health insurance companies to collect money, and they called it the Obamacare tax, that made health insurance companies into the IRS. It made them into subsidies of the IRS. You made health insurance companies into taxation agencies, pseudo-governmental agencies. That's what you did, liberals, Democrats. Like that, I know that doesn't represent the left, but if you voted for Obama or you supported Hillary Clinton and you're saying you're a leftist or progressive now, it's like, come on, you fucked up. That was a bailout for the private health insurance companies. And there's people who still support it because it's like, oh, it's better than what they were on before. It's like, well, it's been so long. It's been like 15 years since before Obamacare. It's like, you're talking about Bush era. It's like, a lot of us were like kids then. There's people who are supporting Obamacare now who were kids under Bush and never had to pay for they have no idea what it was like to try to get health insurance. You have no basis for comparison because you were a kid then. So there's a lot of people talking about politics that they don't really know So they just assume that Obamacare is a step in the right direction. So that was my long rant about myth number 9. Libertarians do not all oppose government health care. We would oppose it if it were run, moderately, sensibly, affordably, and if we allow cooperatives and workplaces to cooperate with each other on a voluntary basis, to pool their money together, to use their purchasing power as leverage against the large, selling power of the health insurance companies. We want the poor and people who don't have a lot of money to use their money and pull it together, use it as leveraging power. We want to help the poor get rich. We want to help the poor economize. We want to help the poor afford the things that they need to live. That's not evil. Myth number 10, we don't support segregation. People like Ron Paul were pointing out, despite what you have to say about the newsletters or who wrote the newsletters, there were racist newsletters in the early 90s, when, by the way, racism was going around like everywhere. Biden, Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, they're doing lots of racist shit. They're Bill Clinton, they're Confederate. There's a Confederate flag, like Bill Clinton, Al Gore, 1992 button. Bill Clinton was photographed with the racist who ran in 68, the one who got paralyzed, I forget his name. So a lot of racism going around in the early 90s. I'm not saying you can't blame Ron Paul for the newsletters, but when people would accuse him of being a segregationist or a neo-Confederate, he would just say, what the fuck is the Congressional Black Caucus? White people aren't allowed to be in the Congressional Black Caucus. And libertarians would say things like, hell yeah, what if there was a Congressional White Caucus? Stuff that leftists say today. They would say, well, if there was a Congressional White Caucus, it would be unacceptable. It's like, is that fair? It's like, if there's a Congressional Black Caucus, there should be allowed to be a Congressional Black Caucus or White Caucus, just as there should be a Congressional Latino Caucus, which I think there is. But it's like, it also, like, they have very few they have very few Republican members. So that's one thing you can say about it. But also there's a thing called, there's an all-black businessmen's association in Madison, Wisconsin, called 100 Black Businessmen of Madison. And there's black-only business alliances in the private sector all over the country. And libertarians support that. And in San Francisco, there was a minority-owned business that was excluding the cops because to them, the police are associated with violence. They wanted to keep police violence out of their business, their coffee shop or whatever. And libertarians, we support that. We support your right to exclude, the redcoats, the police, government workers. The police are government workers. I'm sorry to say, leftists, you got to admit it. I know you don't like police unions. So we support segregation as long as it's being, used, as long as it's participated in on a voluntary basis. Everything can be voluntary. It's like it does make it okay if it's voluntary. Just you have to be able to consent. You have to understand the potential negative consequences as well as the positive consequences. You have to be fully informed. And if segregation or discrimination can be practiced voluntarily in the interests of peace and maintaining public order, then that should be okay. And it's like, that's not a segregationist viewpoint. Barack Obama actually said the civil rights movement, he said this in a college paper, and it's been completely removed from the internet. He said that the civil rights movement turned, it went bad as soon as they started, dipping into illegal activity. Well, it's like, what does that mean? Sitting at lunch counters was illegal activity. I'm not a racist for pointing that out. I'm criticizing the racism of Barack Obama. His statement could potentially be used or construed to say that the civil rights movement went off the rails when people decided, oh, I'm going to trespass on private property. And the whole Heart of Atlanta motel and Title 8, I think, of the Civil Rights Movement Title 2, I don't remember, Civil Rights Act of 1964. The whole private public distinction, that just got completely destroyed in the civil rights movement. So now if you want to say that the public sector should be different from the private sector, or that, you should have the right to keep the cops out of like your business or your house, or like your kid's asshole or your trunk, like you can't keep the cops out of fucking anything. It's like, but what are you going to say? Oh, they're a government worker, so you got to let them in. It's like, we support the use of private property to keep people out of your life and away from your family so you can protect your families and protect your property, whether you're rich or poor. We support the right to shoot the government if they're trying to take your stuff without a warrant, without cause, if you need to do so to protect your wealth, your family, whether you're rich or poor, whether you're black or white. We support the right of black people to have guns. We will support the side of the Black Panthers when they're stopped by Reagan's California government, which took away their right to have rifles at the Mulford Act. We support the right of black people to open carry without government permission. We support the right of Martin Luther King to have a gun, whether his government in Alabama denies him the right to, concealed carry, which they did. We support the right of people to defend themselves. Martin Luther King said that people are dripping from their mouths with the words segregation, nullification and interposition. He was saying that people were defending segregation by saying that using 10th Amendment methods and saying the federal government shouldn't be able to stop. And he was right. But now it's different, We don't have the right to keep the police out of our lives anymore. And we're being just described as closed-minded. It's like we don't trust the system, we don't trust the process, we don't accept the science. We're saying no. Like Republicans and Libertarians are both chastised for being the party of no. It's like, well, no is like, don't have tanks on our streets. Don't take our guns, or don't take away our right to defend our family. Don't take away our right to have money and, make sure you're spending it on something worthwhile and make sure you're not corrupt. So we want responsible government. We want affordable government. We want affordable prices and free markets, and we're the bad guy. We want a way to lift the poor out of poverty without making them submit to some government-controlled union that'll stop them from being able to boycott and strike, and we're part of the problem? No, no, no. But we want to be left alone. That's segregationist, right? We want black people to be allowed to have their own businesses alliances if they want to keep white people off their property just because they're white. Yes, okay. If it's in the interest of public safety, yes, there's a place for making sure you have permission to come onto somebody's property. But the idea is that it's like, yeah, some property is tyrannical. Yeah, some property reproduces the worst aspect of the state on a microcosmic level. Yes, that is true, leftists. But if we didn't have so much government property, we would have more private property. It's not necessarily saying, property where for-profit activities or capitalist activities are taking place. Private can just mean non-state. Everything that's not the state is private. So, there's other sectors like the commons and the charity sector, voluntary sector. But, if there were more private property, if there are more private property owners, this is an idea called distributism. If there were more private property owners, there would be more prosperity. And also, there would be more diversity of what kind of rules are going on different kinds of property. So, as long as there's transparency, as long as you know what the rules and expectations are when you enter someone's property, you can go onto that property usually without a problem. And everyone could have enough land. See, the thing is, if the government owns too much land, then there's not enough for the rest of us. There's not enough land for the workers. There's not enough land to have factories and workplaces. Not enough land to be taking resources out of the ground. So government being too big is a bad thing for both markets and people who are trying to prosper from those markets. And yeah, there are market-free, marketless ways, to have economic prosperity, and that just requires voluntary coordination, voluntary cooperation, and it's not market activity, but that doesn't mean libertarians should oppose it. We don't want to force anyone to participate in markets. We don't want to force anyone to use the government's money. There's some libertarians who are really pro money, or a lot of them have turned to Bitcoin. But if you remind a libertarian that the government's making the money and that it's blood money, and it's backed by arms sales, which is funded by weapons that rain on children's heads in foreign countries, didn't do anything to us, and is usually unconstitutional. Libertarian will usually say, "Oh yeah, money's stupid. Why am I using this? Why am I getting involved in the debt and the credit system?" Libertarians are definitely willing to entertain anti-capitalist ideas. We care more about markets than capitalism, but we care more about economic freedom, whatever that means, than we do about markets. We just want people to be free and to be able to make whatever economic or social decisions they think will benefit them, unless and until it hurts someone, as long as it doesn't hurt someone. That's the idea. Myth number 11, we're not all pro-corporate. You remind a libertarian that the government creates the corporations, they'll usually, libertarians are willing to entertain criticism of capitalism and corporations. There's people like Gary Chartier, Andy Craig in Wisconsin. There's a guy named Tokyo Tom, and they all admit that the government charters the corporations. And yeah, they're I guess, corporations that are not government created, but those are like international corporations, and like they're not really capable of being regulated by people who participate in them exactly. Definitely not their consumers. So it's like, you don't necessarily need government to regulate that, but not all corporations are of the government, but the dominant mode of corporations now is a government regulated, government chartered corporation, and the government allows it insulates corporations from market competition, and that's bad. That's libertarians want more competition in the market. We don't want the government preventing corporations from having to compete against other companies, smaller companies. We don't want the government to protect corporations from lawsuits. We want to extend the right to sue to everyone because we support total inclusivity and total non-discrimination in the public sphere, while supporting total privacy in the private sphere. Public in the public, private in the private. So it's like statists are all like, you got your public and my private. It's like, oh, it's delicious. Well, it's like, now I don't know where the government stops and where I end, and the government's cock is up my ass. So I want a separation of corporations and the people. There's a way to reverse what's happened in terms of banking. People want to go back to Glass-Steagall, but Rand Paul and people like me say go further, reduce the amount of money that the FDIC can insure. That's Rand Paul. Or me, who says abolish the FDIC. Why should the government back up your funds? It's like, at the very least, why should the government back up funds in excess of a certain amount of money? But then that's kind of anti-market too. It's like the point is, you can look over your wealth better than the government can. If you put your money in a bank, like it just ends up numbers in a system. You remember, the government doesn't have to, like, we have fiat currency. There's no gold standard anymore. The government doesn't have to print an equal amount of money, like, in existence to the amount of wealth owned in the country. Like, the banks have a ton of wealth, and if the banks all closed, we wouldn't be able to get our money out. And if we wanted our money out, then the banks would have to close. See, the banks are keeping all the wealth, and they're trying to work with the government to steal all our houses. They're trying to make us poor. They're trying to make us think the government's going to bail us out forever so they can make us stop paying our mortgage and stop paying everything else so that we rely on the government to help. It's what a narcissistic abuser does to us. So we don't hate the poor. We want to lift the poor out of poverty. We want to help the poor sue the corporations. We want to help the poor form unions without getting permission from the government. We want to help the poor boycott and strike without getting permission from the government. We want to help the poor form unions or whatever kind of combinations, business alliances, black people form business alliances, Hispanic people, Asian people, whatever. Have all the property you want. Get that bread, whatever. Use Bitcoin, like use the dollar, invent new forms of currency, like research Josiah Warren, like study Austrian economics, and have a social credit system, have moneyless. We support diversity in economic modes of thought. We don't want to tell anyone you have to or can't use this form of money unless it's backed by exploitation of people, which is, the left-wing libertarians support a non-exploitation principle. The right-ish libertarians or center libertarians who support non-coercion, non-aggression. It's like there's a continuum. It's like overt violence, aggression, coercion, pressure, deprivation, intimidation. It's like you can con people into doing something they don't want to do through punching them, or you can trick them into it. And the softest way to do this is through rhetoric. And that's why libertarians say we don't want to use force to make people obey or make people get along. We want people to be convinced of libertarianism through their own free will and through conversation and rhetoric. We want to hope that our arguments will win out. But if you come to take away my guns, I'm going to shoot you. It's like, sound like a fair deal? Here's one last thing, eliminating taxes. We don't want to eliminate taxes because we hate the poor and want to defund their government. We want to defund the cops. We want to lower taxes until we're sure that the government's going to be not corrupt and going to be responsible, going to be affordable. If we eliminated sales taxes, it would get rid of a lot of unnecessary surcharge, a lot of surplus on the product. It would lower the price of the product at the end of the transaction. And you'd get lower and lower prices eventually. You'd have price competition. That's the one good thing about competition. When you have free markets, prices usually go down because there are a lot of competitors. Competition isn't always about a permanent reward. Only when there's a state and a lot of monopolies does competition lead to a permanent reward. And that's why people are afraid of competition and markets and libertarianism. But when you don't have the state over-regulating and making sure, rigging the market to keep jobs, because because unions work for those companies, and we need to keep jobs at all costs, even if it means industrial stagnation and no new inventions and things like Uber and Lyft. I know there's debate about those things, but they employ large numbers of people that wouldn't have been allowed to come into existence without a loosening of government regulations. But that doesn't mean, if you look at the prostitution thing, FOSTA and SESTA, the government was trying to stop clients of prostitutes or they're trying to stop prostitutes from being able to vet the people to vet their clients. So the government regulation, they're proposing government regulation that stopped the ability of ordinary customers basically or workers to make sure that their customers are safe to work with. And of course there should be measures to make so that people who want to visit sex workers can make sure that that sex worker is not going to torture them or trap them or do whatever. Make sure they're reputable too. There has to be transparency on both ends, and that government regulation would have just gotten in the way. And people like, I think, Justin Amash, they were right, that sex work legislation would have made the sex trade more dangerous and would have increased the amount of abuse and non-transparency in the sex trade. So we want to get the government out of your life. That's the way that getting government out of your life can help sex workers. It's like, yeah, maybe we need more government in some areas, but it's like libertarians, we don't really want to talk about that. Sorry. We'd rather do what we're good at, which is pointing out when the government's corrupt or too big or overextended or is not working properly, is not working the way it's intended. We want to teach you how to use it. So if it works, we can make it work. Myth number 13, we're not all social Darwinists. We're not we don't support competition at all costs. Like I said, competition should not lead to monopoly and permanent rewards. It's only because of the state rigging the markets that competition does lead to monopoly and permanent rewards. If you would get the state out of the picture, then you could have voluntary cooperation and voluntary competition. See, libertarians like competition for when it results in good things like price competition, which leads to lower prices. See, over time, distribution chains and like refinement processes are supposed to get more affordable. It's because you would have more competitors. The more people offering a service, you know, the key is not that they're fighting against each other. We don't want them fighting against each other. But we want them working to develop their craft, each of them, so that they can, so they can engineer something that's slightly different from what the other people are producing. So you can have a diversity of services or a diversity of products. It's fine if they want to cooperate. They could form into a company together, or they could just start kind of doing similar things, but not form into it, a company. But like the point is, libertarians, we would want firms to be able to break up, to, merge with each other freely. And there really shouldn't be much state regulation, involved in it. But we want the consumers and the workers and people who could potentially be negatively affected by the production. We want workers and consumers to be able to negotiate directly to each other's faces. And if you insert the state, then that's just going to slow things down. It's going to bog down with red tape. There'll be all kinds of perverse interests entering into the relationship, and it just increases prices when you don't have consumers and workers negotiating on more or less a face-to-face basis. Getting rid of the government or shrinking the government will get rid of the middleman, or it'll at least shrink the middleman. And yeah, that's why you just have to have voluntary economic activity. And it might seem like a lot of people are being pressured into work, and that's true, but it's because the state confers upon us an obligation to create a surplus. If they didn't tax us so much, who knows? We might have enough to support ourselves. We might even have some left over to give to our friends. Well, it's hard to really tell. I'm sure a lot of libertarians would be open to the idea of exempting the poor, people under $30,000 a year, for example, exempting them from taxes altogether, getting rid of sales taxes. Libertarians support getting rid of the income tax. Well, it's like, you might not like that as a leftist, but it's like, why don't you want to keep the product of your labor? That's the product of your labor. The government's not spending it on anything good. It's spending it on child sex trafficking rings for itself. They're protecting corporations from legally being able to be sued by you. That's what happens when you support the government. You get more police. You get free housing in FEMA camps. You get secret prisons for Mexicans, and as soon as Joe Biden's in charge, they're suddenly, they're made out of fucking candy canes and gingerbread. So, we're pepper spraying Mexicans as they try to come in, and then if they're sick, we're spraying them with toxic chemicals, just like we did 100 years ago. More government is not going to give you good things. The government grew a whole lot after the Patriot Act and 9/11, and that's how we got ICE. So you want to keep growing the government? You want to keep growing the police unions just because they're unions? You want to keep growing union jobs? It's like, save all the jobs, even if they're in bad industries that should have gone extinct due to, immoral practices, or should have gone bankrupt, or, have been replaced by new technologies. Like, the fact that anyone can drive anyone anywhere kind of puts the cabs out of business. And so the cab unions strike. It's like, I half expect the government to monopolize the cab unions instead of legalize Lyft and Uber. Like, yeah, there's a lot of drivers who sexually abuse people. You can have a fucked up driver a lot of the time. But the government, I'm surprised that they would even allow that to happen. Like, we don't even have carpooling. The government's not even promoting carpooling anymore. It's not bad enough we have 6 foot distancing, so now you can't even be in a car with somebody else legally. I don't know if that's true. I don't know. I don't know what's true anymore. I don't know what's legal anymore. I don't know if these 6 foot social distancing ordinances, they're probably not constitutional. A lot of states, they don't even exist. A lot of states, they never had them. And there's an idea of incorporation, 14th Amendment incorporation, and, in conjunction with the Ninth Amendment, which says, like, if a state, if a freedom is recognized in one state, it should be recognized everywhere in every state, because it's like, well, oh, we know that that freedom exists. Like, why should the federal government, why should any state limit your right to have that freedom? If some states have never had to mandate the mask, like, why should any state be able to? And you know, it's like we don't have a set idea of which issues and policy areas each different level of government is supposed to regulate. We don't agree about these things, and even if when we do agree, it's like people bicker about like intent and like how to use it, and like, you know it doesn't make sense anymore. We've gotten to the point where our government is so big that we can't learn how it works because it doesn't work. And that's probably the best argument for libertarianism, other than the fact that we're being lied to and made to look like we want to take everything away from poor people. We don't. We want poor people to have, wealth and opportunity and their freedom of speech back, and their right to make a decision about what happens in their own bodies, and that includes about their health. And we want people to have free strikes and boycotts. We don't want people to have to ask the government permission for every single thing they do and every major, thing they purchase. And every time you walk 5 feet, you have to give the banks have to get certain information from you because of Patriot Act regulations. There's a Patriot Act regulation that says the government gets to look at your library records. How much government is enough for you people, you statists? If you're a Democrat and you're listening to this, like, something's wrong. You know that there's a reason that freedom lovers are being lied about. There's a reason that you have Republicans turning into the party of consent because they don't want the vaccine, they don't want the mask, they don't want you telling them what to do with their bodies. So the Republicans are out consenting you, Democrats. So the Libertarian Party needs to turn into the party of consent, and we need to get the consent of the governed phrase out there. You get people to realize total economic freedom, total social freedom will prevent external political government from being perceived as necessary. There's nothing in that, what I just said, that's incompatible with libertarianism. There's nothing in that that's incompatible with what Vladimir Lenin said in The State and Revolution. Lenin clarified that the Marxists were not statists, that they were communitarians. They support community control. And if we could bring back the commons and also bring back real free markets that aren't rigged by the corrupt government and its corporations, which it creates and controls and charters, and protects from market and legal competition, and protects from challenges and being checked. And, we could restore checks and balances to the system. The state would be limited by the market. The market will be limited by the state. The workers would be limited by the consumers. The consumers would be limited by the workers. There would be a tenuous balance, but everyone would get along because everyone knows they have a job to do. And if you don't want to do a job, you don't have to do that either. You can get a basic income with a group of people who support a political system that has a basic income. You don't have to have even a geographically centered place to have that basic income. You could just have confederations that operate on a panarchist principle, something that Will Schnack has talked about. So you can if you don't like someone's politics, like, their politics shouldn't affect you. Why isn't it that, if I vote for a Democrat, I get governed by a Democrat no matter what? Like, why don't, Democrats win 47% of the election? Why doesn't 47% of the budget go to help the lives of Democrats who voted for that Democrat? and then the 52 goes to the Republicans, and then libertarians get 1% of the budget. Why doesn't it work that way? Because we don't have a libertarian democracy. We have a democratic republic where elections can be bought and who's allowed to compete can be limited, just like we're limiting who's allowed to compete in the marketplace. So we want total freedom at the market, total freedom of choice in the elections, in the ballot box, and the markets alike. And we want total freedom of choice over what you put inside of your body, from a sexual standpoint, from a medical standpoint. We don't want you breathing chemicals that you don't want to breathe. So we don't want some government being able to take your taxes and give it to a corporation that's polluting, but it's also making medical equipment. So it looks really good. It looks really good for their reputation. Don't let people buy you. I don't know what more there is to say than that. The government can make all the money. They can buy you. They control you. Okay? Join the Illuminati. Joining the Illuminati is not going to give your kids protection. They're going to steal your kids. The government's trying to steal your kids through the Social Security system. They're trying to make you poor so that you don't have the resources to take care of your kids, so they can justify taking them away from you. And the government wants you to just be a ward of the state who's out to sea and knows nothing and gives up your power of attorney. They should call it the power of eternity. Don't let the government kill you early. They have an estimation on how long you're going to live. It's like 65, 75 years. And they don't want you to outlive that. They got money on you. They own you. They are taking your labor. You don't even have a chance to make sure that they're using it, in a transparent way, using it responsibly. They just take your money. They don't even give you the dignity of paying you the money first and then saying that you have to pay it by this date. They just take it from you before it's even in your hand. But they're going to give it to you in 50 years, though. That's supposed to make it okay. No. This is not natural. The natural state of humanity is freedom. It's voluntary cooperation. It's mutually beneficial voluntary exchange. And that's what the Libertarian Party supports. We want total consent of the governed. If you don't want to participate in the government, you shouldn't have to. But hopefully you're going to cooperate with some other people, because if you don't cooperate with anyone, if you don't share with anyone, you're going to be alone. If you don't want to cooperate with anyone, then prepare to be alone, because those are the consequences of not cooperating with anyone. That doesn't mean you have to cooperate with the state. Okay, you can be an outlaw as long as no one is expected to defend you. If you become an outlaw because you support freedom, then great. If you support outlaw because you're a criminal and you want to hurt people, then, well, I might not like that, but at least my state is not obligated to protect you or defend you. My state can't steal my money to fund your defense because you're no longer a member of that state. And that's what political independence is all about. The freedom to leave a political arrangement. And they might ask, oh, what's your reasons? And then you give your reasons. And it's like, well, then you got to prove all those things. Well, it all comes down to the right to say no. You don't check with the government, to make sure it's okay for you to go on strike before you decide to go into the Amazon warehouse in Staten Island when there's a coronavirus outbreak. You don't ask the firefighter if he would like to stop you before you go into your own house that maybe you built with your own hands, maybe you inherited from your grandpa, to stop your child from burning alive, because the state wants money from you. They want to give you the money, and then they want to take it back. They want to give you a place to have property. They want to take it back and let the banks have your house. They want to give you the right to raise your kid the way you want for a little while, and then they want to take it away and deprive you so you don't have any way to fight back against them. And spending your life in court is not freedom. So you have to stop being a statist and stop supporting more centralization of government, because that will give you more monopoly and it'll give you more cops, more government workers. You might have more jobs, but you know what? You'll have economic stagnation, and that will lead to perpetual unemployment. And you won't have any innovation to offer the rest of the world, to offer the rest of humanity. Industry will die when there's no economic opportunity, when there's no right to compete and cooperate amicably, depending on what you want to do. There's no economic freedom. We're not teaching people there's any more than two economic systems. We're not teaching people any damn thing. I'm surprised that this video is even going to last a month. There's other ways to think. There's other ways to live. And bashing people who want freedom is not how you're going to get more freedom of speech. It's not how you're going to get more education about how your government works, if there's any hope of making it work. It's not how you're going to get solutions to the economic problems that exist in society right now. That's all I have to say. Stop demonizing libertarians.